Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Paul Conway, aho, ko Chief Economist at Te Pūtea Matua, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Welcome, no mai haere mai, to this webinar in which I'm going to give a speech on the importance of data and economic research, particularly at times of economic change, such as what we've been living through over the past few years. I'm also going to briefly comment on recent data developments since our November monetary policy statement. And after that, there's going to be a Q&A session. And I'm sure you figured out how to submit questions, given that you've found the link and all of that. So yeah, start typing in as we go. And we'll see how many of those questions we can get through at the end of all of this. The speech should be available on our website any minute now if it's not there already. I'm pretty much going to read it out. I'll sort of bounce in and out of it. There's a few graphs that'll come across your screen as well. But in the interest of time, I might sort of summarise here and there, but you've got the speech on the website there anyway. All right, let's go. So the past few years have been unique in many ways, both for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also globally. Economies have suffered a series of shocks that have changed the economic landscape. Some of these changes will fade away in time, but in some respects, be it people working from home more, higher government debt globally, increasing geopolitical tensions, or the changing nature of globalisation, the economy is now significantly different to how it was before COVID-19. So today, I'm going to speak about this evolving economic landscape and the research that we're doing here at the Reserve Bank to understand it. Because setting monetary policy in a time of exceptional change and adjustment is a mighty challenge. So in meeting this challenge, our research agenda provides the Monetary Policy Committee, so the MPC, with relevant and practical insights to help deliver on our monetary policy remit. And much of our current research agenda is guided by our recent review of monetary policy over the 5 years to 2022. So this review, it identified several areas where we need a better understanding of the economy to support high quality monetary policy decision making, and our research agenda aims to provide that understanding. Now, of course, this challenge of understanding and navigating partially uncharted economic waters also highlights the importance of high quality and timely economic data, which I will also comment on. But first, let me briefly discuss some of the economic data that has been released since our November 2023 monetary policy statement. So recent economic data, at the time of the November statement, the balance between supply and demand, or capacity pressures in the economy, was continuing to ease. And this partly reflects the effect of lifting the official cash rate, the OCR, from near 0 to 5.5%. However, at 5.6% in the September quarter of last year, inflation remained too high. In November, we judged that the OCR needed to stay at the restrictive level of 5.5% so that demand growth would remain subdued to assist inflation to return to the 1 to 3% target range. We also highlighted a risk that capacity pressures could surprise to the upside, creating the risk of a further monetary policy tightening later in 2024. Now, since the November statement, gross domestic product growth, GDP growth in the September quarter of last year came out lower than estimated. Also, GDP data going back about 5 years was revised mostly downwards, and you can see those revisions in the figure on your screen. So what do these historical GDP revisions mean for monetary policy? First point I'll make is that it's capacity pressures. It's the net balance between supply and demand in the economy that matters most for inflation. So yes, lower GDP indicates weaker demand, but also that the productive capacity of the economy was lower than previously assumed. So the recent GDP revisions do not necessarily mean that capacity pressures in the economy are much lower than previously assumed. Second, we need to understand the reasons for these downward revisions, and digging into the expenditure GDP data reveals that weaker real, so that's inflation adjusted government expenditure, accounts for much of the revisions, and you can see a breakdown of those revisions in the slide. Some of these downward revisions in real government expenditure is due to methodological changes, such as Statistics New Zealand now accounting for school attendance when measuring value added by the education sector. Private demand in the economy, which is more interest rate sensitive, has mostly been revised up with stronger consumption and business investment than first reported. And again, you can see that in the figure. In fact, the levels of consumption and investment in the third quarter 2023 GDP numbers are almost exactly as estimated in the November statement. Of course, when thinking about GDP, it also needs to be kept in mind that the latest GDP numbers are for a 3-month period that began 7 months ago now. Well, GDP has been revised down. Net migration continues to be revised up. Current estimates are that around 250,000 migrants entered New Zealand over the last year, 250,000, just over 120,000 people left. So that's a net gain of almost 130,000 people, or nearly 2.5% of the population. Now, there are no hard and fast rules about the inflationary impacts of migration. It depends on the size of the inflows and the outflows, the reason why migrants arrived or left, the age and skills profiles of migrants, and the state of the host economy. So in our case, it's clear that strong inward migration has clearly helped to alleviate labour shortages. So in the latest NZIER quarterly survey of business opinion, businesses reported that it has become much easier to find workers. But the demand side effects of migration are also apparent. Strong population growth has likely contributed to continued increases in housing rents and construction costs in the latest consumer price inflation data. So in the December 2023 quarter, rents contributed 0.1 percentage points to the total 0.5% quarterly change. High population growth may also put further upward pressure on local authority rates, which are contributing almost twice as much to annual CPI inflation as they have on average over the past 15 years. Overall, the annual change in CPI in the December quarter came in at 4.7%, down from 5.6% in the September quarter, but measures of core inflation have also fallen. You can see that quite clearly in this graph. However, annual non-tradable inflation, which is a rough approximation of inflation generated within the New Zealand economy, came in at 5.9%, which is higher than we estimated. And you can see this in the graph here with tradables inflation dropping away nicely, but a bit of persistence in non-tradables inflation. So to sum all of that up, monetary policy is working with the economy slowing and inflation falling, but we still have a way to go to get inflation back to the target midpoint. And obviously we will have much more to say on all of this in the February statement, which will be based on an assessment of all incoming data. Okay, so a changing global economy. Let me return to the changing economic landscape of the past few years because we've been living through an extraordinary series of economic shocks. So the COVID-19 pandemic caused widespread economic shutdown and acute global supply chain disruptions. It sped up the digital transformation, and it changed the shape of our cities with people working and shopping much from home, much more than before. Of course, in the middle of all of that, Russia invaded Ukraine, which sent energy and food prices sharply higher, especially in countries close to the conflict. But these factors did spill over into a significant increase in fuel costs in New Zealand, as you can see from the figure on the screen, and also into a sharp rise in the cost of New Zealand's broader imports. You can clearly see that red line there ratcheting up as we sort of got into the pandemic. And of course, back home, almost a year ago today, we had floods and storms over last summer that disrupted the lives of many and added to supply-demand imbalances and domestic inflation pressures in some markets. So what's been the impacts of all of that? High global inflation is perhaps the most obvious macroeconomic consequence of this series of unfortunate events, and you can see that in the figure, New Zealand CPI compared to the OECD average. Inflation increased globally because of sudden surges in global demand and big swings in its composition, coinciding with widespread supply-side disruptions and shortages. Now, of course, expansionary fiscal and monetary policies which were deployed in the early stages of the pandemic to support economic demand and job retention added to capacity pressures in many countries. Now, increased global inflation is just the beginning of the story. The series of events I outlined also kicked off or sped up many other changes across the global economy. The pandemic led to a sharp rise in public debt as governments increased spending and subsidies to counter the initial effects of the pandemic. So across the OECD, government debt increased by about 14 percentage points of GDP, with New Zealand our increase of 23 percentage points well above average, albeit from a relatively low level to start with. Globalisation is also changing in an era of increased geopolitical tension and war. Supply chain resilience and geopolitics have become relatively more important than lowest cost in determining international trade flows. So with nearshoring, friendshoring and onshoring, global value chains are shortening as production facilities are pulled closer to home. Now, as geopolitical tensions ratchet up, global trade continues to be disrupted. For example, container traffic through the Suez Canal is down over 60% compared to average. Climate change is also disrupting global trade, with traffic through the Panama Canal severely restricted due to drought in that country, and shipping costs are increasing globally. Now, more optimistically, the pandemic has sped up the digital transformation. So digital technologies, they gave us the ability to work and shop from home. So it made us much more resilient and adaptable during the worst of the pandemic. And in my opinion, increased digital adoption is perhaps the biggest silver lining of the pandemic. Now, of course, these changes, they're occurring against a backdrop of other large structural forces. As I've alluded to, addressing climate change is going to require swift reductions in greenhouse gases and global adaptation, requiring large investments. An ageing population also poses questions for fiscal policy choices and is a key determinant of neutral interest rates, which I'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so what can we learn from what's been going on around us these past few years? And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that recent global events will be studied for decades to come, because we need to understand the many lessons that this period has to offer and integrate them into our analytical tools and models to inform future policy decisions, including monetary policy decisions. Now, to learn these lessons, we recently reviewed the formulation and implementation of monetary policy over the 5 years to October 2022. And this review found that the formulation and implementation of monetary policy in New Zealand was consistent with its objectives over that 5-year period. And it also highlighted the need for a deeper understanding of the economy in several broad areas, which, as I'll discuss in a minute, now form part of our research agenda here at Te Pūtea Mātua, the Reserve Bank. So the first area where we need some research insights is around the interaction of fiscal and monetary policy. So as I mentioned earlier, public debt has increased over recent years as governments used new fiscal tools alongside stimulatory monetary policy to lessen the economic damage of the pandemic. So in New Zealand, this was primarily in the form of wage subsidies, but a range of other tools such as low-cost, easy access loans for businesses and direct payments to households were used elsewhere. And we need a clear understanding of the economic effects of these new fiscal tools and how they interact with monetary policy, and that will be critical for macro stabilisation in future crises. On the face of it, of course, monetary policy is effective at dealing with excess aggregate demand, while targeted fiscal policy is effective at dealing with distributional issues such as supporting people who lose their jobs. However, However, during the pandemic, the scale of the fiscal intervention also significantly influenced aggregate demand. So this necessitates a continued effort to ensure monetary and fiscal policy coordination is as effective as possible in smoothing out peaks and troughs in the economic cycle in some circumstances. So what exactly are those circumstances? And what are the risks to central bank operational independence, and how can those risks be mitigated? We're working on these and related questions and what best practice monetary and fiscal policy coordination should look like. All right, monetary policy and the supply side of the economy. So prior to the pandemic, under certain circumstances, monetary policy tended to look through the first round effects of supply shocks and only respond if those shocks influence general prices or inflation expectations. For example, we would usually look through the immediate price impacts of a temporary spike in global oil prices if it occurred in isolation. Instead, we would be on the lookout for any spillovers into broader prices for New Zealand goods and services. So in these situations, our focus is on general prices, not a shift in relative prices. So why did we tend to look through supply shocks? Because they've often been volatile and short-lived. So a monetary policy response could just increase economic volatility but do little to keep overall prices stable. Supply shocks also tend to move inflation and employment in opposite directions. For example, responding to a negative supply shock, such as caused by higher oil prices, tightening monetary policy would reduce demand and inflation pressure, but it would also accentuate any fall in employment in the labour market. Now, looking forward over coming decades, given the global trends that I outlined earlier, supply shocks could become larger and more frequent and persistent. So is looking through these shocks still appropriate? In what circumstances should monetary policy respond to bring demand back into balance with supply? And what are the implications for inflation expectations? On the face of it, working to keep inflation expectations well anchored to the target allows relative prices to change in the economy without them spilling over into generalised inflation or deflation. Now, we also need to understand, or better understand, the monetary policy implications of long-run changes in the supply side of the economy. While our monetary policy tools have little to no impact on these trends, these long-run supply-side trends have been shaping monetary policy and will continue to do so, so we need to understand them better. So, for example, as the global economy splinters into blocks of politically aligned countries, globalisation may become less of a disinflationary force than it has been over recent decades prior to the pandemic. So this could mean that we should not expect substantial declines in imported inflation. We might not be able to rely on that to achieve our inflation target. Instead, homegrown or domestic inflation or non-tradables inflation would need to be lower than it has been historically. We also need to improve our understanding of how changing technology impacts on monetary policy. So productivity growth, it's notoriously weak in New Zealand, but digital technologies could reduce the cost of us being globally remote and increase the chances of our innovative ideas being noticed globally. And you only need to look at ongoing breakthroughs in artificial intelligence to see the transformative potential of the new technologies. All right, neutral interest rates. So what are neutral interest rates? It's the rate of interest at which monetary policy is not slowing the economy down nor speeding it up, so neither contractionary or expansionary. So assessing the level of neutral interest rates is key to knowing the stance of monetary policy. And until recently, there's been a very gentle long-run decline in neutral interest rates, both globally and in New Zealand. However, the structural features of the economy that led to low neutral interest rates before the pandemic may be changing. On the one hand, changes in globalisation, higher government spending, and investment into climate change mitigation and adaptation could all mean higher neutral interest rates in future. But on the other hand, population ageing, weak productivity growth, could keep neutral interest rates lower over the years ahead. So improving our understanding of what influences neutral interest rates and how that works will help us better understand the stance of monetary policy. And finally, considerations around additional policy tools. So with low inflation comes low nominal interest rates and the risk that central bank policy rates again hit their effective lower bounds. Now this occurred prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic, with many central banks, including the RBNZ, using additional monetary policy tools to lower interest rates and stimulate the economy. Now, given that these tools are new to us, at least, we will continue to refine our understanding of their macroeconomic and financial market impacts, their implications for central bank balance sheets, and which tools are best suited for different developments in the economy. All right, so what does all of this mean for our research agenda? Well, first and foremost, our research is guided by the need to deliver on our remit. So this implies 6 broad research themes, which are on the screen now. You probably can't read that, but they're in the speech, and you can find all that on our website. Now, some of the work that we are doing within these themes is filling gaps in our understanding that were identified in our monetary policy review. For example, this agenda is helping us build a better understanding of supply-side issues that have been important in fueling recent inflation and also deepening our understanding of additional monetary policy tools and how they transmit to the economy. Now, other research work in this agenda is in areas in need of continuous improvement. For instance, we're always working to improve our forecasting and modelling capability and to develop new sources of data. We also continue to research the labour market because understanding employment and wage dynamics are key to achieving our inflation mandate. Now, to enrich our research, we need to work with others and we need to support economic research in New Zealand. So we are very open to partnerships, not only with other central banks who are working on many of the same issues, but also with academics here and overseas and also the private sector. And we also need to communicate the insights that come out of our research, which means you'll be hearing more from me and others in the economics team here at Te Pūtea Matua as our research and analysis lobs up insights that inform monetary policy decisions, because ultimately we want to improve understanding of how we are likely to respond to economic developments, because this helps strengthen the transmission and effectiveness of monetary policy. Now, just getting towards the end, I want to emphasise the importance of quality data. So frequent and timely releases of high quality data are incredibly important, especially but not only, but especially in times of rapid economic change. Statistics New Zealand have recently added to the number of CPI indicators that are published monthly, meaning that we now have 44% of the basket available at the monthly frequency, which is a very welcome development. Now, data revisions, changes to already published data can also generate uncertainty for monetary policymakers. Data revisions are a good thing in that they result in a more accurate view of the economy. However, more accurate data in the first place would reduce the risk of significant and lagged changes in the starting point for our economic projections. So while the latest set of GDP revisions were large, they were not abnormal. And moreover, the size and volatility of GDP revisions in New Zealand has increased or have increased recently. And there is some evidence saying that the size of our GDP revisions are relatively large in international comparison. Now, the events of recent years have really underscored the need for New Zealand to invest more in producing data that is robust, timely and accurate. And for our part, at the Reserve Bank, we have been investing to improve our measurements of inflation expectations, and we are also exploring collecting much more detailed data from banks to support economic analysis and research, among other uses. We're working with Statistics New Zealand. We have been for a long time, but we're currently working with them on a consultation process that began in 2023 to better understand data needs and priorities. We've always worked closely with Stats NZ to produce and support high quality data. We support investment in maintaining and improving core economic statistics as critical national infrastructure for well-informed and timely decisions. And of course, we're also developing, as I mentioned earlier, new sources of high frequency data to incorporate into the MPC's assessment process. So in conclusion, I just want to say inflation inflation increased in recent years because of sudden changes in patterns of demand and supply side disruptions. Now, these demand shifts would have been challenging for price stability even in the best of times, but the breakdown in supply chains globally and within the domestic economy made matters worse and inflation increased. Now, successfully navigating the current environment and the likely future environment requires a continued understanding of these and related issues so that monetary policy can respond appropriately to future shocks. There isn't just one rule or one model that explains everything. We need to improve our understanding of how the economy works, where we're at in the cycle, and what is most likely coming over the horizon. Thankfully, inflation targeting, which is the policy framework developed in New Zealand, and we've adapted and refined over the past few decades, puts us in a good position to deal with uncertainty, to deal with relative price changes, and to deal with large economic shocks. But better research and data will improve our ability to be flexible in our analysis, adaptable to changing circumstances, and clear on what monetary policy can and cannot achieve. So thank you very much for listening to that. Now we're going to shift to a Q&A session, and James is going to read me out some questions, and some of your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. First question is from Neil Muston of Excalibur Trading. Do you feel the revision to GDP and lower than expected Q4 CPI paint a significant change to the starting point of the next MPS, or are these largely mitigated by other offsetting factors?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. As I said in my speech, and I'm being very careful here, I'm not going to give away anything about the likely future path of the OCR. We'll get to that in a few weeks in the February monetary policy statement, when we've done the work and run the ruler over the economy in a very comprehensive way. And as I said in the speech, the GDP revisions, it's capacity pressures that matter. So, what have those GDP revisions done for our starting point in terms of capacity pressures? So how have they affected our measures of the output gap? And secondly, yes, inflation at 4.7% was a little bit below our 5% pick for the December quarter of last year. But you need to dig into it, and non-tradables inflation, and I understand there are difficulties sort of determining tradable versus non-tradables inflation. As I said in the speech, it's a rough approximation of domestic demand pressures within the New Zealand economy, but at 5.9%, non-tradables inflation is, it's a long way from 2%. So yeah, as I said, we've got a ways to go in our inflation battle. We're getting there. We are making progress, but it's a long way to 2%.
Follow-up question from Neil, and I think you've partially answered it already. Is the significant market analysis over tradable and non-tradable inflation split of great consequence to the RBNZ when the combined rate is hitting the pockets of households?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. Inflation, it's overall, it's headline inflation that really matters for prosperity in the New Zealand economy. So obviously we're very mindful of what's going on within all of the inflation basket. I think our focus on on non-tradable inflation or domestically generated inflation, it's more about what can our monetary policy tools, primarily in the form of the OCR currently, what parts of the consumer price basket can we influence? And there's good empirical work showing that non-tradables inflation, we can actually influence that, whereas inflation pressures or deflation pressures, disinflation pressures coming over the border, such as oil prices and the like, we obviously have no influence over that. So that focus is about what we can influence. And it's a little arbitrary, that split, because obviously using that example of oil prices coming over the border, it's a key input. For businesses. So it sort of has knock-on effects to what's happening domestically. So yeah, it is a tricky decomposition to undertake, but there is signal for us in that decomposition, which is why we pay attention to it.
A question from WO. Given central banks around the world, yourself included, consistently got their inflation forecasts wrong, what work is being done to improve this core function? I'll
sort of stick up for forecasters everywhere. Like, forecasting is a very challenging exercise at the best of times, and the last few years have not been the best of times. It's been a very volatile economy that we've been contending with many sort of issues pushing it around, so it hasn't been a golden period for forecasting. I'll totally accept that. In terms of what we're doing, we've got a lot of research sort of digging into inflation, what drives inflation, what drives different bits of inflation. We're getting into the minutiae of the inflation data, how many of the sort of individual components in there are changing, which are persistent. It's essentially the message of, or a key message of this speech is that we need to, really do relevant research and have the right data, so that we can improve our forecasting performance, because obviously that has a big impact on what we do with the official cash rate, here and now, or at least in the next few weeks. So just to sum up, it's been a challenging time for forecasters. I think we've done work showing that the Reserve Bank actually does pretty well compared to our peers within the New Zealand economy. But yes, we are working hard to improve the accuracy with which we forecast the economy in general, including inflation.
We have a question from Kelly Eckold of Westpac. What do you take from the apparently very weak labour productivity growth in the last year, given very strong population growth but weaker GDP? Does this explain why core inflation has been so persistent, and perhaps it will take a good while to reduce further?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Thanks. Kelly, as I said, New Zealand, our productivity data is not stellar. I want to use this question to make the point. I've sort of talked in the speech about coordination between fiscal and monetary policy in certain circumstances. That might be appropriate, but also regulatory policies. If we did have a really good reform agenda that sort of energised the supply side of the economy through productivity reforms, then our underlying rate of growth would be stronger, and it would be easier for us to get inflation down without imposing short-term pain on the economy. So our underlying rate of growth, would be stronger, meaning that we wouldn't have to be pushing it, towards near zero to achieve our inflation mandate. So yes, please, to pro-productivity reforms.
A question from Glenn Pacey. To what extent do you think the Red Sea situation forcing shipping around South Africa will impact tradable inflation?
Yeah, well, it's how is that going to play out? It just seems to be sort of bubbling away, and with aggression across a broader swathe of the Middle East. So it's definitely a risk. Currently, we'll have more to say on it in the monetary policy statement. So, I mean, it's consistent with what I was saying in the speech, that I'm not sure we can rely on globalisation as much as we have in the past to achieve our inflation target. Shipping prices, have recently just come down to pre-COVID levels after all of the machinations during the pandemic, and now they're starting to bounce back up again. It's significantly more expensive to ship or to not go through the Suez Canal. In terms of what it means for New Zealand trade into Asia, it's a more nuanced issue. It depends on where our trade routes are, et cetera, et cetera. So as I said, we'll have more to say about that in coming statements and the like.
A question from WPAC. Do you think there is sufficient understanding of the economic risks and impacts of climate change? What impact would an effective climate mitigation strategy have on inflation, interest rates, and economic growth?
Yeah, excellent question. No, I don't think there's enough understanding of the macroeconomics of climate change. It's obviously something that we're putting effort into understanding. From a monetary policy perspective, a lot of it is about understanding the impacts of severe weather events, which is a supply side issue, as I talked about in the speech. So again, we need to better understand the supply side. And I think getting our heads around the macro effects of climate change is a key part of that. Obviously, Cyclone Gabrielle gave us plenty to think about. Chances are that type of event is going to become more common, unfortunately, going forward. So we need to understand the macro effects of that and how we should respond. So we've got a chunk of research there directed at exactly that. Of course, climate change, it's also relevant for financial stability, which is another one of our mandates. So, we have research going on to try and understand the impacts of climate change, and that's completely consistent with achieving our inflation mandate.
A question from Kotari Douglas. Do you see minority groups feeling more or less of the effect of these trends and impacts?
Interesting question. I think like our tools affect aggregate demand. Broadly speaking, our tools affect aggregate demand in the economy. So distributional issues, we say that fiscal policy is better placed. Fiscal policy can be better targeted compared to monetary policy to impact different cohorts in the economy. I'm not sort of washing my hands of this issue of the distributional consequences of inflation and changes in interest rates. We also need to understand those distributional effects because that determines how monetary policy affects the economy. So different cohorts within the economy will have different sensitivities to inflation, different sensitivities to changes in interest rates, and we need to understand that to make sure that we are getting policy right, even though policy affects the macro economy, so the economy in aggregate, and can't really get down into that level of affecting outcomes, economic outcomes for different cohorts within New Zealand society.
A question from Kit Lowe of ITC Markets. Given the RBNZ's mandate is on inflation, would a large rise in unemployment while inflation was above 4% mean that the RBNZ focus entirely on inflation only and not change the OCR?
Like in certain circumstances, our single mandate, so we had a dual mandate where we were asked to consider inflation or to target inflation and to support maximum sustainable employment in the labour market. Now it's all about targeting inflation, and normally what's happening to inflation is what's going on in the labour market is a really strong indicator of what's happening with inflation. So all of the time where we had that dual mandate, we never had the trade-off that you described in the question, where the labour market unemployment was going up and inflation was high, and we had to sort of make some kind of compromise across those, the state of the product market and the labour market. But in response to a negative supply shock, we could have employment dropping and inflation going up. So there will be circumstances in which our focus on inflation will trump what's going on in the labour market. I should say, in the long run, low inflation is optimal. It's good for everybody, including obviously workers. So yeah, it's a delicate, tricky issue for us to understand, and it's part of the reason, as I said in the speech, why we are still doing work on what's going on in the labour market, because it's an incredibly important chunk of our economy, and we still need to be right up with what's happening in terms of the labour market.
A question from AL. Does the government have the ability to stimulate the economy or provide support during higher unemployment periods? And how far can the government go with a rising unemployment rate nationally and globally?
Well, this is a fiscal policy question, so I'm not going to sort of go into too much depth, but fiscal policy is better at targeting, as I said, distributional issues. And I think there's really important roles, obviously, for both arms of policy to play, and in some circumstances we need to sort of think about how they play together. But yeah, I'm not really in a position to comment more broadly on fiscal policy.
A question from Dan Brunskill. Do you consider non-tradables to be a more important measure of underlying inflation than the factorial models RBNZ produces itself? Could you shine some light on what the different measures are designed to tell you?
Nice question. I don't think we put more emphasis on non-tradables versus core inflation. They're telling us different things, both of which are important and relevant. So non-tradables, it's a measure of inflation. It's an approximation of inflation pressures generated within the New Zealand economy, whereas core inflation, it's sort of more that underlying rate of inflation within the economy when we strip out in various ways volatile bits of the inflation equation. So both are important. You can split inflation in a number of different ways, and it's sort of consistent with us being, we really need to deeply understand the drivers of inflation, and all of those factors that were mentioned in the question are important.
A question from Brad Olson from Infometrics. Is there a need to dig into price-setting behaviours more at a firm level to understand if price-setting discipline has shifted? That's harder to measure, but might be important to understanding broader trends in price pressures.
So what we're seeing now, non-tradables inflation in New Zealand, it's stickier, it's more persistent than tradables inflation. And I think, in New Zealand there are various reasons for that. We are quite an unusual economy, a particular economy in many different ways. Our markets tend to we sort of have this trade-off between, competition is very good for low prices and efficient businesses, but so is scale. Like big businesses tend to be more productive and therefore, capable of passing on low prices to consumers. And in lots of New Zealand markets, we sort of have this trade-off. It's hard for us to have a competitor or markets that have many large firms. So I think understanding pricing behaviours at the firm level is totally legitimate. Of course, that's sort of more Commerce Commission territory than it is monetary policy. But again, to get monetary policy right, we need to understand the underlying reasons for inflation dynamics in New Zealand. And I think looking at price setting behaviour at the firm level or at the industry level is totally part of that remit.
A question from David Cunningham from Squirrel. Given non-tradables inflation has averaged around 3% over the last decade or two and tradables nearer zero, do you believe this is going to change given your comment that non-tradables inflation is currently a long way from 2%, or is higher than 2% non-tradables inflation acceptable, assuming tradables inflation is nearer zero through time?
Well, yes. If tradables inflation was near zero through time, our remit is to get CPI inflation to 2%. Sort of how that happens, there's different ways in which that can happen. And prior to COVID, you're exactly right. We saw tradables inflation coming over the border was near zero. So, globalization, China being the sort of workshop for the world and exporting disinflation globally, was a big part of the reason for that. Whereas non-tradables inflation was towards the upper edge of our 1 to 3%. Target band. So what I was saying in the speech is that there's a risk, given changes in globalization, given climate change, all those supply side factors that I talked about, there's a risk that the global economy isn't going to be as helpful to us in achieving that 2% overall inflation mandate as what it has in the past. And if that is the case, if that does come to pass, then by definition we are going to need non-tradables inflation generated domestically, to be lower than it has prior to the pandemic. Now note, I'm talking, subjectively. This might come to pass. These are risks at the moment. I'm not sort of saying this is definitely how the future's going to unfold. And we're obviously keeping a watchful eye on all of these developments. But there is a significant risk that tradables inflation will not be as helpful as what it has been prior to the pandemic.
We've probably got time for just a couple more questions. This is about the research agenda. What are you most looking forward to in the research program, and what will be the biggest challenge?
We're in it, we're doing it. Like, there's a really good vibe in the economics department. The research team is on fire. We're really, people really see the value of what that work is bringing to the mahi of the Monetary Policy Committee. So, the research agenda is just a vital part of us achieving our remit. It's hard for me to single out one particular bit that I'm particularly excited about, because the whole thing, it hangs together as a package. It's not just a look at this, a look at that, look over here. It's about what is that whole, how can we use research to construct a compelling narrative of how the New Zealand macro economy works. So the whole thing, it really hangs together very well. In terms of challenges, well, I've talked about the data challenge, the fact that our data is quite lagged and can be significantly revised. I mean, having said that, we've got really good micro data in New Zealand. So there are areas of data, that are where we've got a sort of comparative advantage, if you will, globally on the research front. Research is hard. It's challenging to really nail it, to really get it right, to go beyond sort of casual correlations or whatever, and to get into sort of causality and what's actually driving the inflation dynamics and the macro dynamics that we see. So building that capability, that capacity within the team, we're there now. I believe we've got a great group of people focused on all of that. As I mentioned in the speech, we're really looking for collaboration opportunities. And also, I think a challenge with research is how do you translate the research findings into the policy space? I think, as researchers kind of speak research language, policy kind of speak policy language. But here at Te Pūtea Mātua, we're lucky in that we have people that can sort of cross that divide. They have feet in both camps. So our research, it's practical, it's applied, it's research that people can understand. I'm going to pop up and give speeches on it. It's comprehensible. It's about the world around us. People live in the world, so therefore they can, they should be able to understand what we're talking about in the research space. And by the same token, monetary policy or the Monetary Policy Committee can, fully, who influence the research agenda. What do you really need to know for the next round or over the next year or so, and they can really sort of grab hold of it and run with those insights as well. So that's the ultimate aim, is that our research agenda leads to better, it really helps with making optimal monetary policy decisions going forward.
A question from Sophia Rodriguez from Observatory Group. What is your current view on risks from China, given the monetary policy easing there? Is it to the upside or downside, and how important will it be for RBNZ's monetary policy decision next month?
I'm not going to comment on whether it's upside or downside compared to the November statement. But in the November statement and the August statement, and a bunch of statements prior to that, we have been pointing to the risk of a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy. Obviously, it's a hugely important market for New Zealand exporters, so what goes on in China has an effect here. It's sort of part of what I've been talking about more broadly around globalisation. China was the workshop for the world for a good decade or two. The sort of eastward migration of Chinese peasants and farmers off the farms and into the cities, really was felt globally, and it's just not clear that China is going to play that role again going forward. Obviously, there's risks around China in the property sector, that we're very cognizant of. So definitely a risk factor going forward. As I said, I'm not going to comment whether it's upside or downside compared to what we've said about it in the past, but yes, we are watching the Chinese situation very closely.
A question from Darren. Were you encouraged by the significant step down in the quarterly rates of trimmed mean and weighted median inflation in the December quarter? Yes. I'm really pleased that core measures of inflation are falling and that headline inflation is falling. It's quite an experience for us. The fact that we're so focused on inflation and we get an inflation number once a quarter. It's a big moment in the economics department here at Te Pūtea Matua. I was on the edge of my seat waiting for the numbers. And yes, monetary policy is working. It is reassuring that inflation is falling. But the point that we made in the November statement and that I'm making in this speech is that we still have a ways to go, especially with non-tradables inflation where it is. So we're heading in the right direction, but we are not there yet. Right, Paul, I think we're about out of time now. Thanks very much for those great responses. Wonderful. And appreciate all the questions that came in today. I'll throw it back to you. Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for those excellent questions. Thank you for tuning in. As I said, get used to us popping up a bit more with research and insights over the months, quarters and years to come. Thank you for your time. Very much appreciated. Ka kite.